For decades, Western prosperity was built on cheap credit and ever-rising debt, hidden behind the illusion of endless growth. But as the cost of living climbs and savings vanish, invisible cracks are widening. In 2026, over $2 trillion in U.S. debt must be refinanced, just as inflation surges and younger generations lose hope. If the collapse is silent, why is the warning louder than ever? It all begins with the forgotten deals and broken promises of the 1970s. In August 1971, President Richard Nixon ordered an end to the dollar's convertibility into gold. Overnight, the world's reserve currency was no longer anchored by metal, but by trust alone. That trust was threatened almost immediately. Inflation surged, the dollar wobbled, and oil-exporting nations, suddenly flush with cash, searched for stability. By 1973, the OPEC oil embargo sent energy prices soaring, deepening the crisis across the West. Behind closed doors, United States officials and Saudi leaders crafted a new foundation. In 1974, the United States and Saudi Arabia struck a quiet bargain. Saudi oil would be sold exclusively in US dollars. In return, the Saudis received military protection and arms and committed to recycling their oil profits into US Treasury bonds and American banks. Other OPEC countries quickly followed. The world's most essential commodity was now priced in dollars, and every nation that needed oil needed dollars first. This arrangement, confirmed by declassified treasury, Saudi memoranda, and public OPEC statements, created an insatiable global demand for U.S. currency. Oil profits, called petrodollars, flowed back into Western financial centers, swelling the coffers of New York and London. By 1978, oil exporters were recycling nearly $70 billion a year into United States and European markets. The petrodollar system allowed the United States to run chronic trade and budget deficits without fear of a currency collapse. Foreign central banks, needing dollars for oil, held vast reserves in U.S. assets. American policymakers could spend, borrow, and consume far beyond domestic production, knowing that global demand for the dollar would not fade as long as oil flowed. For decades, this silent engine powered Western prosperity. But beneath the surface, it set the stage for a system built on ever-rising debt, persistent deficits, and a global financial order anchored not by discipline, but by the world's need for energy, and the dollars to pay for it. In September 2008, the collapse of Lehman Brothers sent shockwaves through global markets. The Federal Reserve, led by Ben Bernanke, responded with a strategy that would define the next decade: quantitative easing. Over 3 rounds between 2008 and 2014, the Fed purchased more than $3 trillion in Treasury and mortgage-backed securities. The goal was to push down long-term interest rates and stabilize the financial system, but the consequences stretched far beyond emergency relief. Interest rates dropped to near zero and stayed there for years. Borrowing became cheap, not just for banks, but for corporations, households, and governments. The Fed's balance sheet, which hovered below $1 trillion before the crisis, ballooned to over $4.5 trillion by 2015. Other central banks in Europe and Japan followed suit, flooding the world with easy money. Cheap credit fueled a surge in asset prices. The S&P 500 doubled within 5 years. Home prices in the US and major European cities soared, outpacing wage growth and making home ownership increasingly out of reach for younger generations. Corporate debt exploded as companies issued bonds to buy back shares, pay dividends, or simply refinance at lower rates. By 2024, U.S. non-financial corporate debt would reach nearly 75% of GDP, up from 45% in 2000. The era of zero rates and quantitative easing didn't just rescue the financial system, it created a new normal. Governments borrowed freely, confident that central banks would keep rates low. Investors chased yield wherever they could find it, driving up prices for everything from stocks to real estate to fine art. The addiction to cheap money took hold, masking deeper problems: stagnant productivity, aging populations, and the slow erosion of Western manufacturing. Underneath the rising tide of asset values, debt piled higher, and the risk of withdrawal grew with each passing year. Sarah rises before dawn in a suburb outside Manchester. She is 48, a registered nurse and the main provider for her family. Her father, now in his 70s, moved in after his pension barely covered rent. Her son, 23, works part-time at a logistics warehouse, sending out online orders for a fraction above minimum wage. The rhythm of their household is shaped by numbers that rarely make headlines, numbers that have quietly rewritten the future for millions across the West. In the United States, the share of people aged 65 and older has doubled since 1980. By 2025, the median age in the European Union stands above 44. In Germany and Italy, it is nearly 50. The OECD warns that by 2050, Europe's working-age population will shrink by as much as 1/3. In the United States, labor force participation peaked at 67% in 2000 and has since dropped to about 63%, with most of the decline coming from men in their prime working years. New workers are not arriving fast enough to replace the retirees. The result is a growing imbalance, more people drawing pensions and healthcare, fewer paying in. Matteo, a factory technician in northern Italy, faces a different set of numbers. 30 years ago, manufacturing jobs like his were the backbone of the region. In 1980, the United States employed nearly 20 million in manufacturing. By 2024, that number has fallen to just under 13 million. Italy's industrial heartland has lost 1/5 of its factory jobs since the 1990s. Automation and offshoring hollowed out entire towns. Matteo's plant now runs with half the workers it did a decade ago, and each round of layoffs brings rumors that the next cut will be the last. For those left behind, wages have barely kept pace with costs, and the promise of a secure retirement has faded. Demographic data from the OECD and labor statistics from the United States Bureau of Labor Statistics paint a stark picture. The ratio of retirees to workers is climbing relentlessly. In France, there are now fewer than 2 workers for every retiree. Pension and healthcare spending as a share of gross domestic product is rising across the continent, topping 15% in Italy and Greece. In the United States, Social Security and Medicare outlays are projected to outstrip payroll tax revenues within a decade. Governments face a squeeze, rising bills, shrinking tax bases, and a workforce that cannot grow fast enough to keep up. For Sarah, it means working longer hours and watching her savings dwindle. For Matteo, it is the fear that his job could disappear overnight, with few options left in a region where factories are closing, not opening. These stories, echoed in millions of homes, reveal the hidden drag on Western economies, a slow-motion demographic shift and industrial drain that quietly limits growth, strains public finances, and leaves the next generation with fewer choices than the last. Productivity growth across the West has slowed to a crawl, a long-term slowdown. In the decades after World War II, output per worker rose by more than 2% a year in the United States and Europe, driving steady gains in wages and living standards. Since 2010, that pace has fallen to barely 1%. The promise that each generation would do better than the last has faded into uncertainty. For Sarah, the numbers are unforgiving. Her hospital has shifted to digital record-keeping and automated supply chains, but the benefits rarely reach the front lines. She works longer shifts, covers more patients, and faces constant pressure to do more with less, living under constant strain. Pay increases lag behind the cost of living. The value of her work, measured in output per hour, has barely budged, even as expectations rise. Her son, despite a college degree, finds himself competing for part-time work that offers little security and few prospects for advancement. The link between education and upward mobility has weakened. The housing market tells its own story. In 2000, a typical American home cost just over 3 times the median household income. By 2025, that ratio has climbed above 5. In cities like London, Paris, and San Francisco, it soars past 7 or even 10. Monthly rent now claims a third or more of take-home pay for the average renter, often far more for young workers and families. Saving for a down payment feels impossible. Sarah's son shares a small apartment with 2 friends, each paying nearly half their wages to the landlord. Matteo's niece in Milan puts off moving out of her parents' home, squeezed by stagnant wages and rising rents. Housing. The numbers run deeper than housing. Energy, food, and transportation costs eat into paychecks. Even those who manage to save find their efforts eroded by inflation and low returns. Across the US and Europe, the personal savings rate has dropped well below historical averages. Retirement feels less secure. For many, the only real asset is the home they cannot afford to buy. Savings. The effects ripple through daily life. Fewer young people start families. Household formation slows. The gap between what people earn and what they need to live comfortably widens with each passing year. The silent squeeze of stagnant productivity and rising costs shapes every decision, from career choices to where and how people live. For Sarah, for Mateo, and for millions like them, the future looks less like progress and more like a struggle to hold on. Squeeze. In the spring of 2020, the world's largest economies faced a sudden freeze. Lockdowns swept across continents, businesses shuttered, and millions lost work within weeks. The U.S. Treasury, in tandem with the Federal Reserve, responded at a scale never seen before. In just 9 months, the Fed's balance sheet more than doubled, from $4.2 trillion in February 2020 to nearly $9 trillion by June 2021. At the same day, the U.S. money supply, measured by M2, surged by an astonishing 40% in a single year. Congress authorized over $5 trillion in stimulus, direct checks, expanded unemployment, and loans to keep companies afloat. European governments and the European Central Bank followed with trillions of euros in support and bond purchases. This flood of new money, unleashed with the aim of saving households and businesses, quickly seeped into every corner of the economy. At first, prices seemed stable, rising prices followed. But as supply chains buckled and demand roared back, the cost of everyday goods began to climb. By June 2022, U.S. consumer prices were rising at a 9.1% annual pace, the fastest since 1981. Food, fuel, rent, and basic necessities all became more expensive, squeezing families already stretched by the pandemic. In the Eurozone, inflation hit double digits by October 2022. The cause and effect was stark. Unprecedented liquidity injections collided with real-world shortages, driving prices higher. The U.S. Treasury's role shifted from routine fiscal manager to crisis responder, coordinating with the Fed to keep markets liquid and the government funded. But every new dollar created to fight the crisis added to a swelling tide of debt and stoked inflation. The growing debt burden proved far harder to tame than policymakers expected. The silent cost of saving the economy was a surge in living expenses, felt most by those with the least room to spare. Elena, a retired school teacher in Seville, opens her pension statement and finds the numbers do not add up. Her monthly benefit, once enough to cover rent and groceries, now barely stretches to the end of the month. The math behind her struggle is reflected in government balance sheets across the West. In 2026, the U.S. Treasury faces a $2 trillion wall of maturing debt, all of it needing to be refinanced at interest rates far higher than those locked in during the era of cheap money. This is not new borrowing. It is old promises coming due. Each percentage point increase in refinancing costs adds tens of billions to the annual budget, squeezing out space for social programs and investment. The budget arithmetic is relentless. Net interest payments are projected to reach $1.2 trillion this year, swallowing 14% of all federal revenue. That is more than the government spends on children, infrastructure, or scientific research. For every dollar collected in taxes, 14 cents vanishes into debt service before a single pension check is mailed or a single hospital bill is paid. Official projections from the Congressional Budget Office and the Office of Management and Budget confirm these figures. Private analysts warn that any uptick in rates or an economic slowdown could push the interest share even higher. Pension funds across Europe face their own reckoning. Many relied on optimistic returns that failed to materialize. Now, as payouts rise and contributions stagnate, trustees scramble to fill widening gaps. For Elena and millions like her, the invisible calculations of debt and interest are no longer abstract. They shape every decision, every purchase, every uncertain glance at the future. Central banks once treated the dollar as untouchable. In 2000, nearly 3/4 of global reserves were held in dollars. By 2024, that share had slipped to 59%, according to official data from the IMF. The decline is steady, not sudden. The direction is unmistakable. In March 2023, Saudi Arabia agreed to sell oil to China in yuan for the first time, a deal worth billions and a clear signal that the old rules no longer apply. Russia and India now settle most of their energy trade in rubles or rupees. The BRICS nations, meeting in Johannesburg, announced plans to develop a new payment unit, aiming to bypass the dollar entirely for cross-border trade. These moves are more than diplomatic posturing. They are practical steps to reduce exposure to Western sanctions and to currency swings. Each new oil contract signed in yuan, each central bank that diversifies into gold or into euros, chips away at the dollar's unique status. The privilege of issuing the world's reserve currency once allowed the United States to borrow cheaply and to spend freely. That privilege is now under quiet assault, not by a single rival, but by a growing network of countries building alternatives, one trade, one reserve adjustment at a time. Factories in Guangdong now hum with the production that once defined Detroit or Manchester. By 2025, China alone accounts for nearly 30% of the world's manufacturing output, according to United Nations Industrial Development Organization data, an ascent unmatched since the industrial revolutions of Britain and the United States. Intra-Asian trade, once a fraction of global commerce, now surpasses transatlantic and trans-Pacific flows. Supply chains stretch from Shenzhen to Jakarta. Goods and components circulate rapidly within the region. India, Vietnam, and Bangladesh have joined the ranks of major exporters, building new industrial corridors and logistics hubs. The numbers reveal a lasting realignment. The West's share of global manufacturing has slipped below 25%, while Asia's continues to climb. History offers a lens for this transformation. In the late Roman Empire, production shifted eastward as the western provinces struggled to compete. Centuries later, Britain's factories ceded ground to American and German rivals, even as sterling clung to reserve status. In each case, financial power lingered after industrial leadership faded, but never for long. The world's economic center of gravity is now anchored in the East, not as a sudden break, but as the outcome of decades of accumulated change. The factories, the jobs, and the future of global production have moved, quietly but decisively, beyond the old centers of Western power. The West's economic supremacy is no longer guaranteed. Today, United States debt service alone threatens to eclipse defense spending, while every new global oil deal settled outside the dollar chips away at old certainties. The world's financial center of gravity is shifting. The real warning is not collapse, it's irrelevance. And history shows empires rarely notice the silence that follows their own decline.